Thanks, Jerry. Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk about email. Email is a technology that everybody in the room knows about and is comfortable with, and is a technology that just about everybody who has access to the internet knows about and is comfortable with. And it has one great advantage over some of the other technologies that we're going to be talking about today, that given the structure of the convention, really no other technology can enjoy, and that is the very close metaphor between traditional postal service and electronic mail service. It's built right into the name of the technology. How does the metaphor work? Well, you're all familiar with the post office. You take a letter, you hand it to a civil servant at your post office. They transmit it by some means to a civil servant in the country that you're sending it to, and then it gets delivered by hand to the recipient. And if you're looking at the slide, you see that that's represented by the red arrow, and there's a blue arrow going back, which is meant to indicate that in traditional postal service, we have a very well-established mechanism for proving that something has been received. Namely, the recipient is asked to sign a card, and the card makes its way back to the sender by the same channel. When we think about email, basically it works functionally in the same way. There's a few important differences. One is you see that on the top, which is the traditional postal model, you have flags because the civil service of each country is involved, the government is involved in the transmission. On the bottom, you see instead of the postal service and La Poste, you see we have Gmail and Yahoo. We all use today commercial email that is run by private companies, so that's one important difference. It may be particularly important in certain legal systems. Another important difference is the cautionary function that service of process can serve. You might think, and I think you'd have good reason to think, that having a bailiff show up at your door and hand you a fancy document with seals and wax and ribbons somehow impresses on the defendant or the recipient the importance of the document that's being received better than an email might in your inbox. And the third difference is really a conceptual difference, which has to do with territoriality, and it's something that you heard a little bit about just a minute ago. What does it mean really to say that you're transmitting a document from one country to another, when in fact what you're doing is hitting the send button, sending it into the cloud. Eventually it makes its way to an email server that may be located physically somewhere. Then that server is transmitting it again through the cloud. It bounces from place to place, ending at the recipient's email server, and then is retrieved once again through the cloud. So that the whole notion of territoriality is a difficult fit when we're talking about email. And just to complicate the picture a little more, right here you see the Google server and the Yahoo server located in apparently in a single location, but in reality today, even the email servers themselves are cloud-based, and it can be very difficult even in principle to say that an email server resides in any particular place. What do we mean when we talk about secure email? When I sort of mean three things by security. The first is authenticity. Is the email that you've received, is it what it appears to be? The second is confidentiality. Has someone else other than you, the recipient, and the sender been able to read the email? The third is integrity. Has the email in some way been changed or altered in transmission? And then in parentheses, I've put proof of delivery, because I think that's a very key factor when we're talking about email in this context, even though traditionally we wouldn't say that that's a component of security as traditionally conceived. But these are the things that we mean when we talk about security. And I think that the question we have to focus on is not whether the technology is perfectly secure. The reason I say that is that no technology is perfectly secure. But really, I think the practical question is it just about as secure as what we have now? Is it as secure as traditional postal service? The reason I say that is because we already have accepted postal service as an acceptable method of transmission. And so if we're okay with the traditional post, and if on balance this is just about as secure as that, there's really no security reason to reject email as a method, even if we note that there are some problems or difficulties in making the technology perfectly secure. So let's talk about, is it in fact just about as secure as the traditional post. And here I want to contrast for you authenticity, confidentiality, and integrity for the two technologies. And what's really interesting to me is that if you're talking about email, there are, at least available to you, very strong technical means of providing for authenticity, providing for confidentiality, and providing for integrity. But they are not very widely adopted. And so by these, I mean there's a few possibilities. One, of course, is encryption of the contents of an email. Of course, it's actually quite difficult to encrypt the header of an email, but the contents of the email could be encrypted. But that is a challenge to scale because most typical email users do not routinely encrypt email, and the public key infrastructure that would be necessary to scale that is sort of not widely distributed to everybody in the world. So that's a challenge. In terms of authenticity and integrity, there are strong mechanisms available, most of which have to do with cryptographically signing emails, using information keys that are published in the DNS, the domain name system, which is, as you probably know, a decentralized global database that is used to locate sites on the internet. But again, most of those technologies are not widely adopted. You may know of them by acronyms like DKIM, or for the protection of the DNS itself, DNSSEC. These are some acronyms for technologies that provide for cryptographic assurance that you're receiving what you think you're receiving. They're just not that widely in use. So what about that's the technical side. What about the legal side? Email presents some challenges that the traditional post does not present. The main one is that your email service provider, whether it's Google or Yahoo or whoever, they've got terms of service, and the terms of service probably say something like, we can scan the contents of your email. Your email is not, it's not strictly speaking just for you. There are terms of service from your service providers, and also if you're reading your emails on a work computer, depending on your legal system, your employer is going to have certain rights to read the content in ways that aren't really true if someone sends you a letter at your house. So there are some challenges legally with email that are not present with the traditional post. Now, what about the traditional post? I would say that we have weak technical protections for security. And by that I mean, yes, you put things in envelopes, but anybody can open an envelope. Yes, we have seals and raised seals and signatures, but those can be forged much more easily than, for example, a cryptographic hash function can be faked. So there are relatively weak physical protections, but there are very strong legal protections. So it's a felony to open someone's mail, right? So it's an interesting contrast between the strong technical but weak legal protections that email has versus the strong legal but relatively weak technical protections for security that the post has. And you can make your own judgments about whether, on balance, those risks are comparable. I think that if you consider how much important business is done every day with very large dollar amounts via email, you would have to conclude that the world has basically voted with its feet, so to speak. And we know from the fact that email is so widely used that people regard it in practice as sufficiently secure to do their important business. This takes us to what I think is actually the most difficult point, which is proof of delivery. As I said at the beginning, we have a very traditional and well-established mechanism for proving delivery of a postal letter, which is the receipt card that you sign and it gets transmitted back through the postal channel. Email itself, the email standards, which are not legislative but are universally adopted, has a mechanism for providing a receipt. And if you receive an email, you'll know that sometimes you'll get a box that says the sender would like you to send a receipt, yes or no. The key fact about that mechanism is that it's optional. So it doesn't really fit the purpose of service of process, which is you want to have the assurance that someone has received this document, even if they're not particularly interested in giving you the assurance. So that's the challenge for ordinary email. Now you'll see on the table I've pointed out there's something that I call special email. There are commercial companies that purport to be able to tell you when your email has been received or read, and they do that through a variety of means, having to do with insertion of invisible images, with links that then get pinged so that the sender knows, or through DNS queries. There are various technical means. Now, I took it upon myself a couple years ago to try one of these services out, just to prove to myself that they weren't foolproof. And in fact, you can, and I won't name it so that there's no trade libel issues here, but you can in fact receive emails and sort of spoof or fool these services. So I'm not sure that there is actually a perfect way that anybody can promise you that you're going to get acknowledgement of receipt if the recipient doesn't want to send it. That's email. What about the post? If I just drop a letter into the mail, of course, I don't get any receipt. That's the way that the vast majority of mail is sent. But as I say, there is the mechanism of the signed receipt card that is not really available for email. So I think where I end up on this, and you may draw your own conclusions, is that number one, there is a close functional analogy between email and the post, which makes email particularly suited among all other technologies for use in the service convention context, and that's because of Article 10A. I think that's an issue that Brody may be speaking about a little later. Number two, both technologies have security strengths and security weaknesses. On the one hand, they have legal strengths and weaknesses. On the other hand, they have technical strengths and weaknesses. And in my judgment anyway, you have to conclude that on balance, both are okay. Neither is perfect. And finally, in proof of receipt, that is a challenge for the reasons that I've said. There are some technical means to overcome it, but to my mind, the number one barrier to adoption of email as a method of service that is widely adopted and accepted is the difficulty inherent in the technology in proving that the defendant has in fact received the summons. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me. As was mentioned, I manage the Office of the International Judicial Assistance, which is the U.S. Central Authority for the Hague Service Convention. So I was asked to explore the application of a common electronic platform in the use of sending and transmitting, and also correspondence between central authorities. At first, I'd like to just say, as someone who is both on the sending and receiving side of requests for service pursuant to the Hague Service Convention, we absolutely welcome the use of electronic information technology in the application of the Hague Service Convention. I do think it will have a fundamental impact on the usefulness, on the relevancy of the convention, and again, from someone who deals with the practicalities, it will make our lives a lot easier. Certainly to reduce the thousands of pages of documents that are dealt with on a daily basis, and I think also it will reduce costs overall. So again, I'm going to focus a little bit different from Ted, who spoke about the actual service by email, taking a step back to talk about transmission. So transmission of sending and receiving requests for service, and also communication between central authorities and competent authorities. So why should we consider a common electronic platform, and what kind of useful benefits would it have? Again, goes without saying, and I think we can all agree on these couple points that I'll make, is it will ensure that the service convention will embrace kind of modern technology. It will continue to be relevant and useful. When it was written, certainly was written in mind with having everything reduced to hard copies. And again, as Ted noted, the prevalence and usefulness of email is impacts all of us on a daily basis, both personally and professionally, and certainly its application can be extended to the Hague Service Convention. I do think it will reduce costs. It will not eliminate costs, and I'll illustrate that with an example of why certain things from the U.S. perspective, it doesn't completely eliminate the need for hard copies, but it certainly reduces costs and reduces the need to deal with paper. Efficiency goes without saying. I think that is the single most important and the quickest change that we can see if we talk about transmission of requests electronically is the ability to speed up the entire process, from the beginning of transmission to receipt to the ability to serve and then send all the documents back. That will incredibly change how quickly all of this is processed. In security, I do think if done correctly and done well and thoughtfully, we can ensure that the sender feels secure in sending documents, that the documents are received by the intended recipient, and that the entire process is transparent and there's integrity from beginning to end. So before I talk about challenges and issues, I do want to talk about a couple other aspects of how practically it would work. The idea would be that requests are transmitted and submitted to competent and central authorities by the sending state to the receiving state. The idea is that all correspondence, subsequent correspondence, as well as the proofs of service are also sent back through electronic means. I think one of the most practical impacts would be the ability to correct defects and ask questions. What's something that the U.S. Central Authority has strived to do is not return requests for service that are defective, but try and reach out back to the applicant to try and correct a defect. You can imagine sending thousands and hundreds of pages back and forth is not what we all want to be doing. So the ability to quickly and efficiently correct defects and correspond, whether it's with private applicants, competent authorities, and central authorities through electronic means, will greatly impact the ability to successfully execute requests for service. Make payments, again, not applicable to every single country, but certainly for countries that impose fees, to have a secure and efficient way to make those payments. I know it's difficult as every country kind of has its own requirements on how to make payments and what the payments are and so forth, but to have a common place where all of those payments can be made securely would be useful. I think the ability to kind of have a running dialogue and pose questions and share information. Right now, certainly one of the most useful places to go is the HCCH website, the practical information pages. But I feel like there's a lot of times, again, speaking from my perspective as the U.S. Central Authority, I'd like to disseminate information perhaps. I think having a common electronic platform where we can share information and developments and news and pose questions to each other in a secure way, perhaps not ready to be published in the public domain, but within those intended recipients would be a useful way to develop the platform. Again, goes without saying, having all of the forms in a central location, being able to complete the entire package, the request for service, all in one place, and be able to transmit it electronically. Again, it just makes things easier and it speeds up the process. The ability to track requests for service. Some countries do have that ability now, but to have a common place where, with appropriate login information, parties can track individual requests for service would be useful. And certainly something that I think all of us would be benefit from seeing are data, statistics, being able to run reports. I think we're all interested in looking at the numbers, and those numbers at times are provided to HCCH. But I think being able to run different kind of statistics and analytical reports would be interesting. I think it will help keep central authorities perhaps a little more accountable to each other. When it comes to execution of requests and the time frame for execution of requests. So that's some of the obvious benefits and some of the functionalities that would be useful to see in a platform. But those improvements would certainly come with issues and challenges. And again, I will share the perspective of the US experience in terms of the practical aspects of what it would like to have to use a platform. For not just for the United States, but for other countries as well, there's going to be issues of public versus private sector access. As some of you know, the U.S. Central Authority has delegated the ministerial function of service to a private process server, a private contractor. So the access to who has access to that electronic platform is something to consider, whether that would be public versus private access, and then what kind of access would it be for incoming versus outgoing requests. I think it's a little complicated to take an off-the-shelf platform that may exist already, and I know some kind of systems have been floated by, but I think there isn't one right now that would have the ability to address all of the different ways that central authorities have chosen to implement the Hague Service Convention. And again, one of those ways is, who has access to it, and should there be different levels of access, perhaps for the public versus the private sector, perhaps for incoming versus outgoing requests for service. One of the other challenges that I think are, again, practically speaking, as someone who sees these requests for service, is the size and the volume. So when I talk about size formatting, so one of the ways that we still continue to implement the Hague Service Convention in the United States is that we have to personally serve documents. So we choose to personally serve documents for the time being. Because of that, even for requests that are electronically submitted, those are still printed out. And at the end of the day, one of the challenges we have is that we receive documents in all kinds of formats and sizes, so it does present practical challenges to have to print these documents. And the volume. At times, I think, people are cognizant about what pages, the volume of pages, the number of pages that are sent, and they try and stick to the most important. In the United States, that would be equivalent to the summons and complaint. But a lot of requests we receive number in the hundreds and thousands of pages. So just because we're reducing things to electronic means doesn't mean that we're actually reducing the volume of documents that we're serving and asked to serve. And I think that's something to keep in mind in the future as well. And again, I talked about different challenges to access. And my attempt at creating a graphic to show how the platform would have to accommodate who has access to it. Certainly, a lot of countries, their central authorities handle both incoming and outgoing, and everything is funneled through the central authority. There's other countries in which different competent authorities are able to submit requests for service to one central authority. But again, there are situations where you have different competent authorities and private parties who are considered competent authorities are processing both the incoming and the outgoing. So I think that one of the biggest challenges is what kind of access and what kind of platform can accommodate those different applications of the Hague Service Convention. The costs implicated in having such a platform, and I think having a platform that's maintained, that's updated, that accommodates all of the issues and challenges would certainly not be one. Again, I'm not aware of one that would be available to us right now, so it would be something that would have to be developed and maintained. And I think something to talk about are the formalities still that countries impose on each other. We have requests for service that are returned because the Hague model form isn't signed, like an original blue ink signature. Certainly the requirement of needing duplicate copies, original documents. So having a discussion about ways that we can move away perhaps from some of the continued requirements of formalities that are imposed on each other would make things a lot more useful. Right now, again, in terms of how we implement the convention and request for service, is we do require duplicates, and then one set is served on the person identified in the request, and then the second set is returned with the proof of service. It would certainly help matters to not have to return that second set of original documents back and be able to electronically return the proof of service. And again, talking about security, extremely important in terms of a platform where you're going to have something so centralized to talk about security, to talk about data privacy, both thinking about GDPR or the Privacy Act in the United States, having such a platform which is going to have quite a bit of personally identifiable information about a lot of people. It is important to think about what kind of security and data privacy protections would need to be in place. And again, for me, practically speaking, to think about the large documents and packages that are received on a daily basis by the United States, and be able to reduce those to, whether by email or a common electronic platform, it will fundamentally and immediately reduce the time that it takes to process these requests. It will reduce the human error in having to manually enter in information. If everything happens to be automatically uploaded, it will make a big difference and account for human error. And it will, and again, speed up the entire transmission process. I think it will improve the communication between competent authorities and central authorities. And this is the number that I thought about. This is the more or less average number of requests the United States receives in terms of just incoming requests for service. So to think about, and this number, by the way, is a conservative number. There's been a steady increase of requests that we get every year. 2019 will surely go over 9,000. As of now, less than 10% of these requests are sent electronically to us, even though we do accept electronic transmission of requests. So to think about this number of paper requests being reduced to email or submission or uploading to a common electronic platform, as you can imagine, immediately would have an impact on how we go about doing our work, on how efficient and effective we are, and kind of the modernization and application of the Hague Service Convention.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand this over.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Emma, and I'm doing a PhD at Rotterdam University. My PhD is on online dispute resolution and how it can influence access to justice. But today I will talk about distributed ledger technology, DLT. So first, it's a very hyped technology. Everyone's talking about blockchain, about Bitcoin and DLT. It's a very complex technology, so I will first try to explain what it actually is. So on the right, you see DLT. So DLT is actually a database which contains, maintains, and stores data within the distributed network. So the novel feature of this database is that there's no central authority. So every ledger, so every party within a distributed ledger has the data, exactly the same copy, but there's no central authority. So how to support and improve the operation of the service convention? Of course, the main advantage is efficiency. So as Katerina also said, it's a very paper-intensive and human labor-intensive process. So the blockchain can save costs and save time. Also, the dependence on the intermediary is mitigated because there's no intermediary anymore in a distributed ledger. You can have a direct communication between the central authorities, so you can have a platform where central authorities directly communicate without an intermediary. So you have two types of DLTs. You have the permission DLT and the permissionless DLT. So the permissioned needs prior approval to be part of the blockchain. And the permissionless, actually everyone can just join in the blockchain. And a blockchain is one of the most well-known forms of DLT. So the digital records are actually stored within blocks. And these blocks are actually cryptographically linked with each other. And how this works is that every block contains, next to the data, it contains a hash function, which actually corresponds to the previous block. So then it contains a chain. So also transparency can be improved in a DLT because every party can see an exact copy of the data, so it's more visible and more transparent. It's also immutable, so when you store data within a block, it cannot be changed anymore. So it's immutable. Of course, software is also sensitive to bugs in a code or malfunction of the system. So what are the limitations of implementing DLT in a service convention? So there's no regulatory framework on blockchain. It raises question what laws will apply when something goes wrong, what state has jurisdiction when something goes wrong. There are also no uniform technical standards. So DLT is a very complex technology, but also when you implement it on a more national level, you have very different types of implementation, so this actually challenges a more interoperability of the DLT system if every single state has its own method of implementing technology. Then you have another party actually entering the scene, which is the software provider. To a certain extent, we place trust in the hands of a software provider, but this is not without risks. Also, who will be accountable, and it creates a certain power imbalance because there's much more knowledge within the software providers about these complex technologies. Then you have scalability issues because the blockchain has predetermined blocks. If you have a service convention on a global level, you have a lot of states or parties to the convention which can join. And also on a more cost level, so it's often proclaimed that this technology can save a lot of costs, but at the same time, adding a block to a blockchain is a lot of time and cost-consuming process, a lot of energy consuming, like thousands of computers running all this code, adding to the blockchain. It costs a lot. So the interoperation of the DLT platform, so this is actually when you implement the DLT on a national level, it's different. So what I already said, it challenges the interoperability. And then another thing is the confidence. So even for us, blockchain DLT is a very complex technology. And when you go on to a more practical level, judicial officers working with this complex technology, is it realistic? Is it feasible in the near future? I think we really have to see what is realistic now in modernizing the service convention than embracing all these hype technologies without really knowing, okay, on the more practical level, how can we actually implement this? And also, it's hard for us to imagine living a life without technology and internet. For a lot of people in the world, internet access, but also knowledge about how to use technology and how to use the internet is still not everyone can do it yet. So the digital divide is still a problem we have to take in account to ensure a true access to justice for everyone in the world.
Thanks very much, Emma. Thank you.
It's true, Emma, you have already mentioned the topic. I will talk about making national IT-based systems for transmission of information interoperable. And I would like to discuss this question, of course, in the context of the Hague Service Convention. I start here with a reference to Article 1, section paragraph 2, which might be a bit surprising. This is the address requirement. But why do I mention the address requirement? In the context of the Hague Service Convention, we have to have a certain territorial nexus, I suggest. We have to have a recipient state, and we must define as the recipient state because it's the internal law of the recipient state which plays a role. And of course, it might be a declaration or an objection in relation to Article 10, which also might be essential if we talk, for instance, about email service. So these are issues in the context of the convention which we must think about. Now, how do we determine a recipient state under the convention? I think that's a very tricky question if we talk about electronic addresses for service. My proposal is not to discuss the location of email service providers or so on. I think you have perfectly illustrated that this is without any reason, and it has no connection with the case and the issues at stake. I would propose that the e-address shall be attached to the territory of a state through the internal law of the respective state, which kind of gives permission to regard the address as an electronic address. So now I propose a model which gives, I would say, a large degree of discretion to the national states, and I think that this is inevitable. I would call it a registration model, and it might remind of incorporation of companies, where so you incorporate your electronic address within the laws of a particular state, and then this is the connecting factor. If you follow the rules of the national state, you have an address which is an address under the laws of this state, and this state, if you're served with this address, is then the recipient state. There are requirements that must be defined or are already defined in certain states or will be defined in certain states in national legislation. We might imagine a student studying The Hague, an Austrian national. After some weeks, he might have a permission to receive a Dutch electronic address and might be served within this address. After some time, when he leaves the country, this address will be deleted again. Which law might make such definitions? Which law might provide for such requirements? It can be only the national law. We can, of course, think about future conventions having a more harmonized system, but this is not the talk of today, and I think this is not the talk of this century as well. So other states might, of course, require registration not on the basis of residence, but maybe on the basis of registration for tax purposes, tax residence. Other states might have different requirements. So it will be defined always on the national level, and it will be national priorities, I think, which determine this structure of electronic addresses. Why do I favor this state permission system? I think that an electronic address should be part of a state infrastructure like a street, like a motorway, and not a free marketplace, so to say. Why do I believe in this? I think there must be state priorities which should shape the e-address regulation. State priorities might be non-discrimination, might be protection of vulnerable groups, might be accessibility, resilience, security, traceability, protection of data. So many of these aspects have already been mentioned. These are not priorities of private market players, but these are priorities of regulators. And therefore, I think on the long run, these kind of electronic addresses will be very interesting for serving documents, for transmitting information under the service regulation. What else? Of course, we already have to some extent such systems in place. Some people are working on DLT laws here in different member states. And these national investments should be reserved instead of being replaced. And they will always, of course, differ. So that's why I talk about making them interoperable. Why will these national systems always differ? Because different national states might have different traditions. There might be a state in which citizens are used to have the post being responsible for this. There might be states in which people are used to have tax authorities being responsible for electronic addresses. So the preconditions in each state are different, and I think that this is all part of a national investment, and I think the accessibility of an address in a national state largely depends on preserving this national investment too. So what we need on the cross-border level, if we want to connect different national systems, is a system which I would describe by the keywords, which is subsidiary and enables semantic interoperability. This is a chart, because I'm not as good in drawing charts as others here. This is a chart which I took from the e-codex system. And we see that even within the European Union, there is no possibility to have a uniform platform for cross-border transmission of documents. But again, they rely on national systems and focus on making them interoperable. Now we have a point for discussion. I think it's a quite small picture on the slide, but what we have here is a gateway. It could be also a gatekeeper, so to say, and between these gateways, of course, we have to have a way of translation of different national transcripts, electronic transcripts. They will be based on different IT technology, they will be in different languages, and there must be kind of a translation to a different language, which is the international language. And they will, in this different language, communication between the gatekeepers or between the gateways will take place in a secured connection. That's the way how one could imagine it will be done. And if we see these gateways, we of course think about whether these gateways could replace central authorities or whether these gateways in essence are central authorities, because maybe central authorities in a fully automatic system of transmission are no longer people printing out documents and forwarding them, but maybe are electronic systems, central gateways. But this is of course a point for further discussion. Having said this, we of course have to accept that in cross-border cases, not every state will immediately be able to take part in an electronic transmission. This is due to different legal, financial, cultural obstacles that state parties to the convention need. To some degree, they need to be progressing at different speeds. I think we have to be aware of that. I don't think that a uniform centralized system will be easier implemented or faster implemented. Once we have different national systems in contact, once we have collaboration especially in order to define the international transcript, I think there will be hand in hand, there will be harmonization. National authorities will learn from each other, so we should not underestimate these dynamics, but we must honor the different preconditions each state has and the different priorities. Is it really true? I would say so. The recent amendment to the proposal of the EU Service Regulation recast from 28th of November 2019, for instance, says in Article 14a that service may be affected directly by electronic methods available under the law of the forum member state for domestic service of documents. So even within the European Union, we have voluntary acceptance and we have a subsidiary approach, and I think that we cannot go further under the Hague Service Convention. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Florian. And I'm going to actually turn you right back to Ted. Thank you. On the question of the email infrastructure, perhaps you had some thoughts about it. I saw you scribbling.
Yeah, I thought, Florian, your idea was really interesting. I had sort of two thoughts about it. The first is that I wonder whether the system you're envisioning would be acceptable to those states that really have a very strong feeling that service of process in their territory is an aspect of their sovereignty. You know, as I'm thinking through what it would mean, for example, to live in China but to have a Dutch registered email address, it seems to me just prima facie challenging to think that that would be acceptable to the state where the person physically is, without a lot of work being done over a period of years to get people comfortable with the idea. Because I think right now there are many states that have a very strong feeling about the impermissibility of sort of accomplishing judicial things in their territory without the involvement of their authorities. Also, I think that the sort of the arc of history in terms of how email has developed, you know, back in the 80s, certainly the Uniform Postal Convention does contemplate an e-post type service. And at least in the United States, at an early period, there was some effort in that direction. And I know that there are some countries today that have, to one degree or another, e-post type services. But the overall history of internet technology, whether it's for good or not for good, has been towards privatization. So I think that that your proposal is smart because it recognizes the disconnect between just the thoroughly territorial nature of this convention that was written in the 60s and what we have today in terms of technology. But it also is going to be sort of swimming upstream against the overall trend of where technology is going.
Great. Thanks very much, Ted. What do you think, Florian?
Well, I think that maybe in the last 5 years we became more aware that the internet is not as extraterritorial as it appeared to be in the last century, and well, things like geo-blocking and so on, states locking up the internet connection. I don't know if this is really the discussion, but I think we are more and more becoming aware of that there is a territorial nexus of the internet, and as lawyers, of course, if there is none, we can construct it in a way. And the other aspect which I want to touch upon is I was reading the Service Convention over and over again, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I had the impression that there is no residence requirement or so on in this Service Convention. So that makes it very interesting from my approach.
Thanks, Florian. I'm wondering, in terms of interoperability in the DLT, of course, we just talked about countries that close off their borders to certain email providers, to the internet, for example. DLT, in principle, one of the things that people keep selling about it, is how global it can be, and how this technology really increases access to every person on the street. You have a computer, you hook up, and there you are with the. What do you think? I mean,
I think DLT is too complex to ensure a real accessibility for people. You see it also within ODR. A lot of people don't access the internet. They don't know, for example, the ODR platform of the EU. No one knows about it. No one uses it because it's very complex. So to ensure accessibility within something like blockchain, I think we are some steps away from that. Yeah. So we would first embrace technologies like email or like electronic platforms which are already there, which are known, used, trusted to a certain extent, and I think that's the first step to accessibility.
Oh, that's very fair. No, thank you. It's quite interesting when you think about it. I think 12 or 13 years ago, we didn't have iPhones. You think about it. I mean, it's a decade and a little bit more, and that's why the decade's so interesting. We didn't have smartphones. I was organizing this event with my whole team. We were going back and forth on WhatsApp and versus text messages. How do you do it without that? If I don't know a question, I ask Google now, or I ask Bing, or I ask somebody. And that's the interesting thing. So you have the internet, which is supposed to be global. DLT is supposed to be global. It's a question of trusting that technology. But then I would like to kind of go back to that thing that Florian said. What do you think, Katerina, of central authorities being gateways? The central authority is a trusted figure. It is an authorized figure. Does it give some legitimacy, some trust maybe, and some access to this?
I mean, I can tell you right now, yes. Right now, I think the approach is still very formalistic in nature, and where central authorities in certain countries place more emphasis, like I said, on the legalization, on the hard copy originals. You know, countries still insist on receiving their original documents back. We still receive requests that are, you know, with the seal and you know, ribboned and all of that. So as part of an extension of that is also the legitimacy and the trust and dependence on central authority. It's a government, you know, entity, it's a public entity. So I think right now, if we're realistically speaking, we're not there yet. I think that we need to embrace it. But I think how we conceptualize the role of the central authority and who the central authority is, what, you know, my experience is very different than what you're talking about the central authority being a gateway. But I do think that's where we're going. I think that right now, how and everyone approached this in a very good way, and Florian, I think you mentioned, is that we're all in different speeds and different implementation. The applicability is quite different in every state. So to talk about one common technology that's going to unify how everybody applies the convention is difficult to talk about, again, in realistic terms.
Right, no, thank you, Katerina. That's very practical and very realistic. Before I turn it to the audience, we have had a comment on our Facebook page. Adrian Brisgovey, who basically asked, I have a question whether you plan to introduce an application, or a website in which member states could send documents for service in civil and commercial matters. He agrees with you. Serving paper documents consumes a lot of time and causes delays in recognition of court proceedings and so on. And I suppose he posted it on the HCCH's Facebook site. And so the question basically for our panelists is, do you think in terms of legitimacy, if we take a technology that is recognized, secure email or an electronic platform, and centralize it, you know, globally, that there might be some appetite, both at the individual level as well as at the central authority or with practice, to use this platform, at least for the transmission of requests? What do you think? Who wants to be brave and go first? Maybe Katerina, since you're right next to me.
I mean, from our perspective, yes. I think there's an appetite. I think there's we can talk about it in realistic terms in the near future, talking about like what are the steps that we can take now. I think, realistically speaking, serving by email is still, we're further away from that being a unified approach as opposed to the transmission aspect. The transmission aspect in my head is the low-hanging fruit. It's like we can actually get this done. Right. And the way we can do it, whether it's we can do email tomorrow, right? Everybody has email. I think the common electronic platform is also a fantastic idea. Again, talking about, I mentioned, it's a little bit different for every country, but I think there is an appetite for it. I think it can be done. I think it will absolutely make an overnight impact on the process of transmission of requests and the efficiency and the operability of the convention.
Great, thanks so much. Would any of our other panelists like to add anything?
You talk about centralization, Jerry. You know, the United States is an interesting example because for us, private lawyers are competent to transmit requests abroad. And so, you know, I think that is not familiar everywhere in the world. And it's interesting to hear Katerina's perspective. I would be very interested to hear the perspective of a central authority in a country for whom the idea of private lawyers transmitting these requests is unfamiliar, because I think that in those countries there would be real sort of cultural or just sort of conceptual advantages to some sort of centralized platforms, because then rather than receiving, you know, emails from Ropes and Gray and this firm and that firm, everything would be routed through some sort of platform that has the imprimatur of the system overall. No one wants to deal, this is just my experience, no one wants to deal with private lawyers interacting with central authorities directly.
Right. So that's actually the advantage of that common platform, that basically everyone logs on to the same platform. Everyone's an equal user in that sense of that platform. I'm going to ask if anybody in our audience would like to comment or say anything or have any questions, you know what to do if you have any questions or comments. I see a hand there. Who has the nice blue box? Right across. Brody, I need you to help just in case. Whoa, that was a good one. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I knew I wouldn't catch that, but that's fine. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion from everybody. I don't understand blockchain at all. I've understood it a little bit better now, but I don't feel qualified to ask a question about it. But on the email and the common platform, these are issues that we've been tackling at EU level recently, and it's fascinating to hear a wider context. But I think, is there not an issue about proportionality and pragmatism in email, for example? Because if somebody has already agreed to accept service by email, do we need to think about, well, do you need to have all the bells and the whistles in terms of security if that's already been provided? And on the common platform, I know my EU colleagues will remember that I had a lot of concerns about this from a practical point of view. I can see that the advantages in terms of tracking, in terms of saving the costs and the time of airmail and everything else. But as Katerina, you said yourself, the issue about if you're going to then serve by using paper, you have huge amounts of costs then, and you don't save any space in the office, for example, because you've got to print the whole thing out. And I think until we get to the point where we can do everything electronically, it isn't going to be the answer to all our problems. But I can see it's the way forward. But thank you very much for sharing that with us.
Thank you very much. Would either one of our speakers like to respond?
Yeah, I completely agree. I have one of my points, which was, yes, we can talk about the transmission aspect, but bottom line, the use experience being what it is right now, which is the fact that we still print out the documents. We only, if you're going to send a request for service pursuant to the convention, it's going to be only served by personal service in the US, which means we print out the documents. So it helps with the, I guess, the transmission, internationally by mail, by postal channels. It helps cut down the number of paper, but it's just a reduction. It's not solving the larger issue. It's just an incremental step towards addressing the larger issue. So the question is, do we address it as a whole, or do we take that incremental step? I think for the U.S. perspective right now, we're not there to address the wider issue. I think it's, and again, we can spend all day talking about it, but in the United States, it's going to be very different because, service by mail right now is basically determined by state law. So it's not something that myself as the U.S. Central Authority I can even address at a national, federal level. It gets very complicated. So, we can take that incremental step with transmission. Does it address the larger issue? Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. It doesn't right now.
All right, thanks very much. We have one last question we're going to take. It's not a far toss. Yes, please. If you just hand it over, I think that's the safest. Yeah, there we go. Yes, madam.
You talked about efficiency and you related to a speed up. The question is that you talked about the proof of receive and not of the proof of efficient receive. What about the person? What about the question, are the persons really receive the document? I didn't listen from you to hear about what the real, what about the service, what is the service of document? The service of document is the secure process of giving in the person that is concerned the document. And all is about efficiency, all is about, the point is about not if really the person receives this document. What about if, for example, this email is not used even more? What if this service of document, it is addressed in a dead person's email address? I've never heard of you these points, and it will be very, very interesting to focus on the real effect of receipt of a document that in my opinion, it's really if this person receives. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point. One of the things about email that's different than the traditional post is if I send you a registered letter and it's addressed to you and it has your signature on it, then I know that you've received it. If I send an email to your email box, then transmission and receipt are all complete, whether or not you actually ever click on it and read it, or whether someone else who has access to your email box does the same thing. So I think it's a terrific question. I think that it's important to know or to think about the ways in which that problem exists, even with traditional post. So for example, if I send a registered letter to someone and the postman shows up at my door and my wife signs for it, those kind of problems exist in the physical world as well as in the electronic world. And so I think that the real question is are those two situations comparable or not? Is it a bigger problem in the electronic sphere? I think that the other aspect of the problem is that there are a lot of intermediaries between you, if you're receiving an email, between you and the sender. So the sender will transmit it to that person's email server. Then it may go through some filters, spam filters, virus filters, etc. It then ends up at the recipient's email server. Again, there's going to be filters and software in there that can prevent the message from reaching the sort of the final inbox, even if it's been properly transmitted to your email server. And that's invisible to the user in many cases. So I think there are particular challenges with email receipt that don't exist in the physical world, and you're exactly right to point that out. That being said, I do think that if we think about how we all live our lives, despite the problems, we all still manage to conduct our important business by email. The trick with service of process as opposed to other kinds of electronic communication is that, if you are determined to have received the email and you don't respond to the complaint, that has juridical consequences for you, and so you're right to emphasize the problem.
Thanks very much, Ted. I saw one. We're going to take the final question there. Would you please toss the box over? Just toss it. Good catch. Well done. That was a 2-point toss. Very good.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to be brief. I was reading Article 1, Paragraph 2, and it says that no service can take place if where the address of the person to be served is not known. Okay, the address is not known, but the electronic address of the service is known. What is the alternative? If we use domestic channels, the recipient will never be aware of the service, because at least in my country, in Greece, we post it in 2 newspapers of the town. But if you have to serve proceedings, let's say in Italy, the Italian will not buy a Greek newspaper to see whether he is served proceedings or not. So in the worst case scenario, I would support electronic service in those cases, and probably there is also a proposal to increase the radius of the service convention, and not to say that the convention does not apply, but the convention applies perhaps also in those cases if electronic service is possible through an address which is known.
Thank you, yes. Before you toss that, just see how far the thought experiment goes, would you also support service or transmission of requests by social media or by tweeting? So a bit like the newspapers, but online.
We have discussed this with Ted several times, and yesterday also. I'm in favor as the last resort.
Thank you.